The call from my son came on my 72nd birthday. "Mom, I've scheduled an appointment with our family attorney. Just some routine paperwork for your protection." Daniel's voice had that smooth, practiced tone he uses with his investment clients. I should have recognized the warning signs right then. 45 years of raising him, and I still wanted to believe the best about my only son. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months later, I stood in my kitchen, as Daniel handed me a notice to vacate. "Mom, we've talked about this. Willow Creek has an opening and they're holding it for you. The house is just too much now." He gestured vaguely around the home I'd owned for 4 decades, the home where I'd raised him after his father passed. "Victoria's already packed most of your essentials." I stared at the document, trying to process what was happening. Just last week, I'd discovered my checking account had been emptied. "Consolidated for better money management," Daniel had explained. Now this. "I'm not moving to assisted living, Daniel. I'm perfectly capable of living independently." I pushed the paper back toward him. His smile never reached his eyes. "Mom, we have power of attorney now. This decision isn't actually up to you anymore. It's for your own protection." That was the moment I realized my son had stolen my life right out, from under me with my own signature. But what Daniel didn't know was that Raymond Chen, my attorney for over 20 years, had seen this coming long before I did. And he had quietly put a backup plan in place that was about to change everything. It started with small things. Daniel. And Victoria suggesting I needed help with finances. Questions about whether I was still comfortable driving myself. Concerned glances exchanged when I misplaced my reading glasses. I dismissed it as their worry, maybe even love. After all, I'd been a widow for 15 years, living alone in the 2-story colonial that had been home since Daniel was in elementary school. "Mom, you're not getting any younger," Daniel would say, stopping by unexpectedly in his tailored suits, scanning my kitchen with that financial advisor scrutiny. "Have you thought about what happens if you fall? Or forget to pay a bill?" I laughed off his concerns. "I taught high school mathematics for 35 years, Daniel. I think I can handle my checkbook." What I didn't mention was how he'd never worried about my capabilities until Edward passed away and left me financially comfortable. The pivotal moment came during last year's Thanksgiving dinner. Victoria had insisted on hosting at their Lakeview estate's home, all granite countertops and gleaming hardwood that felt more like a furniture showroom than a family space. I'd brought my famous apple pie, made from scratch with fruit from my own backyard trees. "Oh, Margaret, you shouldn't have gone to all that trouble," Victoria said, taking the pie with manicured fingers and quickly sliding it toward the back of the buffet, behind her store-bought desserts. "You know, with your arthritis and all." "I don't have arthritis. Never have." That evening, as everyone gathered in their formal dining room, Daniel clinked his glass. "We have something important to discuss." He glanced at Victoria, who gave a practiced smile. "Mom, we've been talking about your future." The conversation that followed was clearly rehearsed. How they worried about me rattling around in that big house. How stairs were dangerous at my age. How they'd researched some wonderful communities where I could be among peers. Daniel had even prepared a slideshow presentation on his tablet. My grandson Tyler, home from his first semester at college, looked uncomfortable. "Grandma seems fine to me," he offered, earning a sharp look from his mother. "Tyler, adults are talking," Victoria said. "Your grandmother nearly set the kitchen on fire last month." I set down my fork. "That's simply not true." "Mom, you left the burner on," Daniel interjected smoothly. "If I hadn't stopped by, who knows what might have happened." What actually happened was that Daniel had unexpectedly visited while I was making tea. The kettle had just started to whistle when he walked in unannounced, using the key I'd given him for emergencies, and made a production of turning off the stove as if he'd prevented a catastrophe. I was making tea, Daniel. The kettle was whistling. That's how kettles work. Victoria sighed dramatically. See how she gets defensive now? Dr. Watkins said that would happen. I looked around the table in confusion. Who is Dr. Watkins? The geriatric specialist I consulted, Daniel replied as if this were completely normal. Mom, we're concerned about cognitive decline. The room suddenly felt very cold. They had discussed me with a doctor I'd never met, made plans for my future without my input, and now were presenting it as a foregone conclusion. I said carefully, setting my napkin beside my half-eaten dinner, that I'd like to go home now. We're just trying to help, Margaret, Victoria said with practiced sympathy that never touched her eyes. Tyler can drive you, Daniel offered, already turning toward his vibrating phone. I need to take this call. On the drive home, Tyler was quiet until we pulled into my driveway. Grandma, he said finally, are you really okay? Like for real? I looked at my grandson's concerned face, so much like his grandfather's, and felt a surge of tenderness. I'm more than okay, Tyler. Don't let them worry you. He hesitated. Dad's been talking to banks and stuff about your accounts. Is that normal? A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the November air. No, Tyler, that's not normal at all. The next morning, I called Raymond Chen. Raymond had been my attorney since before Edward died, helping with our wills and the house title. He agreed to see me that afternoon. His office was exactly as I remembered. Warm wood paneling, law books lining the shelves, the faint scent of coffee. Raymond himself had aged gracefully, silver hair replacing the black, but his shrewd eyes were unchanged. Margaret, he said warmly, rising to greet me. It's been too long. I explained what had happened at Thanksgiving, and Tyler's concerning comment about Daniel and my accounts. Raymond's expression grew serious. Have you checked your accounts recently? I have my statements, I began, but he was already shaking. His head. Online. We need to check online, right now. He turned his computer monitor toward me and helped me log into my bank account. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. My primary checking account, which should have contained over $4,000, showed a balance of $237.46. My savings account, which had held nearly $30,000 from Edward's life insurance, was completely empty. I don't understand, I whispered. I haven't withdrawn this money. Raymond was already printing the transaction history. Multiple transfers to an account at First National. Is that your account? I shook my head. I only bank with Oak Ridge Community. His expression hardened. Margaret, when was the last time you spoke with Daniel about your finances? He's been offering to help for months, but I always declined. I paused, a memory surfacing. Although about 3 months ago he did bring some papers for me to sign. Insurance updates, he said. Just routine things. Raymond's eyes narrowed. Do you remember what exactly you signed? I tried to think back. It had been the morning of my birthday. Daniel had stopped by with coffee and muffins, so cheerful and attentive. He'd mentioned something about updating my policies, placed several papers in front of me, chatting the whole time about Tyler's college achievements. I'd signed where he indicated, distracted by his unusual display of warmth. I'm not sure, I admitted, shame washing over me. He was talking about Tyler, and I just trusted your son, Raymond finished gently. Of course you did. He asked me to wait while he made some calls. I sat there, feeling foolish and afraid. How could I, who had taught teenagers to think critically for decades, have been so careless with my own security? Raymond returned 20 minutes later with a grim expression. Margaret, I've confirmed that Daniel filed for power of attorney over your affairs 3 months ago. The papers appear to be in order with your signature. He's also initiated proceedings to have you declared mentally incompetent. The room seemed to tilt. That's absurd. I'm perfectly competent. I know that, Raymond said calmly. And we're going to prove it. But first, we need to understand what we're dealing with. He leaned forward. Tell me about your house. What about it? Is it paid off? Valuable? I nodded. Edward and I paid it off 15 years ago. It's in a good neighborhood, probably worth around $380,000 now, according to my property tax assessment. Raymond made a note. And your other assets? We spent the next hour cataloging everything. Edward's life insurance policy, my teacher's pension, investments, even family heirlooms. By the end, it was clear I was worth considerably more than I had realized. Daniel's financial practice hasn't been doing well, Raymond said finally. His partner Wesley Parker is facing a lawsuit for mismanagement of client funds. They could be looking at significant settlements or even bankruptcy. I felt sick. You think my son is trying to take my money to save his business? Raymond chose his words carefully. I think Daniel is in trouble, and he sees your assets as a solution. The assisted living angle gives him control without raising suspicions. What can we do? I asked, my voice small but determined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Raymond's expression changed, a hint of steel behind his professional demeanor. When Edward came to me before he passed, he was concerned about exactly this scenario. Not that he didn't trust Daniel, but he worried about influence from others. He didn't need to say Victoria's name. Edward asked me to create a contingency plan, one that would activate only if someone attempted to take control of your assets improperly. We're going to implement that plan now. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt a spark of hope. Edward, even from beyond, was still protecting me. First, Raymond said, we need to document your mental competence. I'm scheduling appointments with 3 separate specialists: a neurologist, a geriatric psychiatrist, and a cognitive assessment expert. Independent evaluations. And then we spring the trap Daniel doesn't know exists. Raymond smiled thinly. But we need to be strategic. For now, don't confront Daniel. Act as if you're considering the assisted living option. We need time to put everything in place. I left Raymond's office with a list of appointments and instructions. As I drove home, carefully, within the speed limit, stopping completely, at every stop sign, I rehearsed how I would act around Daniel. Compliant, perhaps a bit confused, exactly what he expected. That evening, Daniel called. Mom, did you get the Willow Creek brochures I left on your counter? Yes, dear, I said, injecting just a touch of weariness into my voice. They look very institutional. It's a premium community, he corrected. We've already put down a deposit to hold your space. Victoria's excited to help you downsize. I clutched the phone tighter. That's very thoughtful. When would this happen? We're thinking right after the new year, new beginnings and all that. His voice took on that patronizing tone he'd developed recently. Don't worry about anything, Mom. We'll handle it all. I bet you will, I thought, but said aloud, I suppose I should start sorting through some things. Great! Victoria can come over tomorrow to help you decide what to keep. After we hung up, I sat in my garden room, surrounded by the houseplants I'd nurtured for years and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to cry. Then I wiped my eyes, picked up my phone, and called my old friend, Eleanor Morales. Ellie and I had been friends since our college days. While I'd chosen teaching and family, she'd pursued a career in banking, retiring as a senior loan officer. More importantly, she'd navigated a messy divorce from a manipulative husband in her 40s. If anyone understood financial self-protection, it was Ellie. They've done what? Ellie's voice rose in indignation when I explained the situation. Peggy, that's elder abuse, financial exploitation. It's illegal. Raymond's handling the legal aspects, I assured her. But I need a place to stay, just temporarily, where Daniel won't find me when things come to a head. My door is always open, she said without hesitation. The cottage has plenty of room, but Peggy, are you sure you don't want to confront him now? Raymond thinks it's better to let Daniel believe his plan is working. If he suspects I'm fighting back, he might accelerate his timeline. The next day, Victoria arrived with color-coded stickers and empty boxes. Green for keep, red for donate, yellow for maybe, she explained as if talking to a child. But remember, your space at Willow Creek will be much smaller. I nodded meekly and watched as she began placing red stickers on my cherished belongings. The grandfather clock from Edward's family, artwork we'd collected on our travels, even my gardening books. These won't fit in your new lifestyle, she declared. What about my photo albums? I asked, pointing to the shelves of carefully preserved family history. Victoria wrinkled her nose. So bulky. We'll scan the important ones. By the end of the day, my home of 40 years had been divided and devalued, my life categorized by a woman who had known me less than a decade. When she left, promising to return with more boxes, I immediately removed every sticker and called Raymond. It's happening faster than we expected, I told him. They've already put a deposit on this facility. Victoria's packing up my house. We need to accelerate our timeline too, he replied. I've scheduled your evaluations for this week. Can you make all 3 appointments? I'll be there, I promised. The neurologist was thorough, running me through memory tests, coordination exercises, and cognitive assessments. Mrs. Wilson, your brain function is excellent for any age, he concluded. I see no concerns whatsoever. The geriatric psychiatrist and cognitive specialist reached similar conclusions. All 3 provided detailed written reports confirming my competence. I delivered the sealed documents to Raymond personally. Perfect, he said, adding them to a growing file. Now, about your financial accounts. I've documented the unauthorized transfers. The next step involves something called a springing durable trust that Edward established. What does that mean? It means that certain assets, including your house, aren't actually in your name alone. They're held in a trust that springs into action under specific circumstances, like someone attempting to seize control of your finances through power of attorney. Hope bloomed in my chest. So Daniel doesn't actually have control of my house? No. And here's where it gets interesting. Raymond leaned forward. The trust has a provision for challenging the power of attorney if there's evidence of financial exploitation. We now have that evidence. As I drove home, I felt stronger than I had in months. Edward had foreseen this possibility. Raymond had prepared for it. And now I was ready to fight. That evening, Daniel stopped by unannounced again. Mom, good news. We can move up your transition to Willow Creek. They've had a cancellation, so a unit is available next week. He looked around at my distinctly unstickered belongings with a frown. Where are all the labels Victoria placed? I feigned confusion. Labels? Oh, was I supposed to leave those on? I thought they were just suggestions. Daniel's jaw tightened momentarily before he forced a smile. No problem. Victoria can redo it tomorrow. He pulled out his tablet. I need you to sign these move-in forms. I glanced at the screen he pushed toward me, a contract for Willow Creek with a monthly fee that made my eyes widen. This is quite expensive, Daniel. Don't worry about the cost. It's all arranged. His tone was dismissive. With my money, I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Daniel's expression hardened. Mom, we've been over this. You're not thinking clearly anymore. That's why I have power of attorney now, to protect you from financial mistakes. He pushed the tablet closer. Sign here. We need to secure your spot. I took a deep breath and channeled my best confused elderly mother expression. I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed, dear. Could I look these over tonight and sign them tomorrow? He hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Fine. I'll stop by in the morning before work. He stood to leave, then turned back. And Mom? Don't call Ellie or anyone else about this. They don't understand your condition like we do. After he left, I called Ellie immediately. He's moving up the timeline, I told her. They want me in Willow Creek next week. Then you're moving in with me tomorrow, she declared. Pack? What matters most tonight? I'll be there at 9 with my SUV. Next, I called Raymond. We're out of time, I explained. Daniel's pushing for me to sign assisted living contracts tomorrow. Don't sign anything, Raymond instructed. Stall. Him one more day. I'll file our counterpetition in the morning and have him served by afternoon. Once that happens, he'll know you're fighting back. That night, I carefully packed 2 suitcases with clothing, medications, and irreplaceable keepsakes. Edward's watch, our wedding album, the handmade quilt my mother had created. I placed important documents in a secure folder. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote a letter to my son. Not the man he had become, but the boy I had raised. The boy who had once brought me wildflowers from the yard. Who had cried on my shoulder when his father died. I wrote about my disappointment, my heartbreak, but also my resolve. This letter wasn't for delivery. It was for me. A reminder of what had been lost and what I was fighting to regain. Not just my assets, but my dignity. In the morning, Ellie arrived precisely at 9. We had just finished loading her car when Daniel's sleek BMW pulled into the driveway. He emerged, tablet in hand, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. Mom, what's going on here? Where do you think you're going? His voice carried across the lawn, causing my neighbor Howard Jenkins to glance over from where he was collecting his newspaper. Good morning, Daniel, I replied calmly. I'm going to stay with Ellie for a while. His face flushed. Absolutely not. We've already discussed your living arrangements. The Willow Creek paperwork is ready for your signature. He turned to Ellie. Mrs. Morales, I appreciate your concern, but my mother is experiencing cognitive decline. She's not making sound decisions. Ellie drew herself up to her full height, an impressive 5'3", and fixed Daniel with the glare that had intimidated banking executives for decades. The only unsound decision Margaret made was trusting you with her finances. Daniel's professional mask slipped completely. This is none of your business. Mom, get back inside. Now. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. Let go of your mother. The deep voice came from across the yard. Howard Jenkins, my retired judge neighbor, stood watching with narrowed eyes. Before I call the police and report elder abuse. Daniel released me instantly, reverting to his smooth persona. There's a misunderstanding here. My mother has been evaluated. By doctors you selected and paid, I interrupted. Not exactly. Impartial. Daniel's phone chimed. He glanced at it, his face losing color. What have you done? He whispered. That would be Raymond Chen serving you with papers, I said steadily, contesting your fraudulent power of attorney and documenting your financial exploitation. You can't do this. His voice was no longer smooth. It was desperate. The agreements are legal. I have control. Not of everything, I replied. Edward was smarter than that, and so am I. Howard had moved to stand beside me. I suggest you leave now, Mr. Wilson, before this situation escalates further. Daniel looked from me to Ellie to Howard, seemingly realizing for the first time that he was outmatched. Without another word, he returned to his car and drove away, tires squealing on the pavement. As Ellie and I pulled out of the driveway minutes later, I looked back at the home I'd shared with Edward, where we'd raised our son, planted gardens, and built a life. I wasn't sure when, or if, I would return. But as we drove toward Ellie's lakeside cottage, I felt something unexpected. Not grief, but possibility. My life wasn't ending. It was beginning again, on my own terms. And thanks to Edward's foresight and Raymond's backup plan, I had the tools to fight for exactly that. Ellie's lakeside cottage in Harbor Point was everything my house wasn't. Small, cozy, and delightfully uncomplicated. Nestled among tall pines with a view of the water, it had a simplicity that immediately put me at ease. The guest room was snug, with a patchwork quilt on the bed and windows that caught the morning light. "It's not fancy," Ellie said, setting my suitcase beside the dresser. "But Daniel won't think to look for you here." I sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the morning was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. "I never thought I'd be hiding from my own son," I said quietly. Ellie sat beside me, her weathered hand covering mine. "You're not hiding, Peggy. You're regrouping. There's a difference." That afternoon, Raymond called with updates. His voice was confident, reassuring. "The judge granted our emergency injunction," he explained. "Daniel's power of attorney is suspended pending investigation. He can't access any more of your accounts or make decisions about your property." "What about the money he's already taken?" I asked. "We've filed for an accounting and recovery of misappropriated funds. The bank is cooperating. They've flagged the transfers as potentially fraudulent." Raymond paused. "There's something else you should know. The assisted living contract Daniel was pushing? The monthly fee was nearly triple the standard rate." My stomach tightened. How is that possible? The contract included something called Comprehensive Family Management Services. Essentially, Daniel's firm would have been paid to manage your finances while you were in care. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Not only had my son tried to control my assets, but he'd also created a way to funnel my money directly into his struggling business. It was sophisticated, calculated, and utterly heartbreaking. "Margaret, are you still there?" Raymond's voice pulled me back. "Yes," I said, steadying myself. "What happens next?" "Daniel has been served with papers requiring him to appear in court next Tuesday. In the meantime, stay with Eleanor. Don't return to your house alone, and don't engage with Daniel or Victoria if they contact you." After we hung up, I sat on Ellie's deck watching the late afternoon sun sparkle on the lake. A family of ducks paddled near the shore, the mother leading her ducklings in a perfect line. I thought about my own maternal journey, the sleepless nights with a colicky infant Daniel, the proud tears at his college graduation, the joy of watching him become a father himself. How had we arrived at this point? My phone buzzed with an incoming text. "Daniel. Mom, you're making a serious mistake. I'm only trying to protect you. These friends don't have your best interests at heart. Call me." I showed the message to Ellie, who snorted. "Classic manipulator language. Notice how he's trying to isolate you from your support system?" A second text followed. "Victoria is very upset. Tyler is asking questions. You're tearing this family apart." "And now he's using guilt," Ellie observed. "Textbook." I turned off my phone. Whatever Daniel had to say could wait until court. That evening, as Ellie and I shared a simple dinner of soup and homemade bread, my thoughts turned to Edward. My husband had been gone for 15 years, but his protective instincts had anticipated this crisis. I wondered what he had seen in our son that I had missed. Edward never trusted Daniel with money, I admitted to Ellie. He would give advice, but never loans. I thought he was being too harsh. Ellie nodded thoughtfully. Edward was a good judge of character. Remember when he warned us about that investment scheme half the neighborhood fell for? I did remember. Edward had been cautious, sometimes frustratingly so. While other families took lavish vacations and bought new cars, we lived modestly, investing for the future. At the time, I occasionally resented his frugality. Now I was profoundly grateful for it. I just keep wondering where I went wrong with Daniel, I said, voicing my deepest fear. Was it something I did? Something I failed to teach him? Ellie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Stop that right now. You were an excellent... Mother, Daniel made his own choices as an adult. This isn't your failure, it's his. Her words helped. But that night, I lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, replaying moments from Daniel's childhood, searching for signs I might have missed. Had he always been calculating, or had something changed him? Had Victoria's influence corrupted him, or merely amplified tendencies that were already there? I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the scent of coffee brewing. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then yesterday's events came flooding back, and with them, a surprising sense of resolve. Over breakfast, Ellie helped me make a list of what needed to be done before Tuesday's court appearance. Contact my bank to report the fraud. Gather documents proving my mental competence. Secure valuables that remained in my house. We should go there today, I decided. Daniel has a client meeting on Thursdays. He won't be monitoring the house. Ellie looked concerned. Are you sure that's wise? I need documents from my home office, financial records, medical reports, and there are some things I don't want Daniel or Victoria to get their hands on. I was thinking of my mother's jewelry, Edward's military medals, the handwritten recipe cards passed down through generations. Ellie nodded. I'll call Howard and ask him to meet us there. Better to have a witness, just in case. Howard Jenkins was waiting in his driveway when we pulled up to my house. At 75, the retired judge still cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a full head of silver hair and alert eyes that missed nothing. Ladies, he greeted us with a courtly nod. I took the liberty of walking the perimeter. No sign of anyone, but there's a lockbox on your front door, Margaret. I froze. A lockbox? I didn't authorize that. Howard's expression darkened. I suspected as much. That would constitute breaking and entering, among other violations. We approached the front door, and sure enough, a realtor's lockbox hung from the handle. My hands trembled as I used my key to unlock the door. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, but obviously disturbed. Drawers stood partially open. Empty spaces gaped where decorative items had been removed. A stack of flattened, moving boxes leaned against the wall. They're packing up my house, I whispered, anger rising beneath my shock. They're actually packing up my house. Document everything, Howard advised, his phone already out, taking pictures. This will be excellent evidence of unauthorized access and attempted property conversion. I moved through the rooms in a daze, noting what was missing. The silver tea service that had been my grandmother's. The small impressionist painting Edward and I had bought on our 25th anniversary. Even some of my clothes appeared to have been sorted through. In my home office, I found the filing cabinet drawers hanging open, folders disturbed. I quickly gathered what I needed, tax returns, medical records, insurance policies, and placed them in a tote bag Ellie had brought. Check the hiding places, Ellie suggested, the ones Daniel wouldn't know about. Every long-married couple has secrets, not necessarily dark ones, but private understandings. Edward and I had created several hiding spots for valuables throughout the house. I knelt by the fireplace in the living room, pressing a specific brick that loosened to reveal a small cavity. Inside was a velvet pouch containing my mother's sapphire earrings and Edward's pocket watch. In the kitchen, behind the loose baseboard, we'd never fixed, I found the envelope of emergency cash we'd always kept on hand. In the false bottom of a hall closet shoebox rested Edward's military decorations and our original wedding bands. One by one, I reclaimed these treasures, these pieces of my history that Daniel hadn't managed to discover and appropriate. In my bedroom, however, I received a shock. My jewelry box, the obvious place where anyone would look, had been completely emptied. Diamond earrings Edward had given me on our 30th anniversary. The pearl necklace I'd worn to Daniel's wedding. Even costume pieces with only sentimental value. "They've been through everything," I said, a tremor in my voice. "How could he do this?" "Because he stopped seeing you as his mother and started seeing you as an asset to be managed," Howard said bluntly. "I saw it countless times on the bench. Family members who convince themselves they're entitled to an elder's property because they know better how to use it." We were about to leave when my neighbor from across the street hurried over. "Margaret, thank goodness you're all right." Susan Brady engulfed me in a hug that smelled of gardening soil and herbal tea. "Your daughter-in-law told everyone you'd had some kind of breakdown, that they were moving you to a facility for your own safety." I stiffened. "She said what?" Susan looked embarrassed. "She and some woman I didn't recognize were here yesterday with a real estate agent. Said they were preparing your house for sale because you couldn't live independently anymore. Something about hoarding and unsafe conditions." She glanced around, my meticulously kept living room. I knew it couldn't be true, but they were very convincing. Even had papers they said proved they had authority. My hands curled into fists. The only unsafe condition in this house is my son's character. Howard placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Mrs. Brady, would you be willing to provide a statement about what you witnessed? It could be very helpful in an upcoming legal proceeding." Susan nodded vigorously. "Absolutely. What Victoria said didn't sit right with me at all. Margaret's sharper than most people half her age." Before leaving, I walked through each room one last time, saying a silent goodbye. Not permanently, I hoped, but recognizing that this space no longer felt entirely mine. It had been violated, its sanctity breached by the very people who should have protected it. In the garden room, I paused to water my plants. Some had already been removed, but most remained, reaching toward the sunlight that streamed through the glass. Life, continuing despite disruption. I found that surprisingly comforting. As we drove away, I looked back at the house where I'd raised my family, where I'd loved and lost and carried on. Daniel hadn't just tried to take my assets, he'd attempted to erase my autonomy, my history, my very self. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. "You know what the hardest part is?" I said to Ellie as we turned onto the main road. "All those years I spent teaching Daniel right from wrong, and somehow he still convinced himself that stealing from his mother was justified." Back at the cottage, Raymond called with troubling news. "Daniel's attorney has filed a counter-petition," he explained. "They're doubling down on the competency issue, claiming your resistance proves your judgment is impaired." My grip tightened on the phone. "That's absurd." "It's a common tactic," Raymond said. "They're also requesting an emergency hearing to reinstate the power of attorney based on what they're calling reckless behavior, namely, you're leaving your residence without supervision." I closed my eyes, fighting a wave of indignation. "So I'm reckless for not submitting to financial exploitation?" "Exactly. They're twisting your self-protection into evidence of instability." I could hear papers shuffling on Raymond's end. "The good news is, the judge assigned to the case is Frances Wilkins. She's known for her strong stance against elder exploitation. And we've got solid documentation of your competence." "What about the money Daniel's already taken?" "We've traced most of it. As I suspected, a significant portion went to cover margin calls on investment losses at his firm. The rest appears to have funded deposits for Willow Creek and some rather extravagant purchases by Victoria. Designer handbags, jewelry, even a hot tub installation at their home. All within the last 3 months. My stomach churned. All those years of careful saving, of Edward's prudent financial management, squandered on luxury items while they planned to warehouse me in an overpriced facility. Can we get it back? Much of it, yes. We've already frozen the accounts where the money was transferred. Their spending spree is over. Raymond's voice took on an edge I hadn't heard before. Margaret, I don't normally say this to clients, but this case is personal for me. Edward was my friend, not just a client. What Daniel has done, it's a betrayal of everything Edward worked for. We're going to make this right. After the call, I sat on Ellie's deck, watching the lake turn golden as the sun began to set. A profound weariness settled over me. Not just physical fatigue, but soul-deep exhaustion. I had spent a lifetime nurturing my son, believing in his fundamental goodness despite occasional disappointments. Now I had to accept that the child I raised had become a man capable of calculated exploitation of his own mother. My phone, which I had turned back on for Raymond's call, buzzed with a text message. Tyler. Grandma, are you okay? Dad won't tell me what's going on. Can I come see you? I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Tyler had always been closer to me than to his parents. At 19, he was legally an adult, capable of making his own decisions. But he was also caught in the middle of an ugly family conflict, and I didn't want to force him to choose sides. After careful thought, I replied, I'm safe and well, sweetheart. Staying with a friend for now. Some disagreements with your father about my living arrangements. I'd love to see you, but understand if timing is difficult. His response came seconds later. Willow Creek is BS. I know you're fine on your own. Dad took your jewelry. I saw the boxes in his office. My heart constricted. So Tyler had witnessed some of Daniel's machinations. Another text followed quickly. Can I meet you somewhere tomorrow? Not at home. Dad's being weird. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop halfway between Ellie's cottage and Tyler's campus. I was both eager and apprehensive about seeing my grandson. Would he believe me? Would he report back to Daniel? Most importantly, would this conflict damage our relationship beyond repair? That night, I dreamed of Edward. We were sitting in our garden room, surrounded by the plants and books we'd loved. You're doing exactly right, Maggie, he said, using the nickname only he had ever called me. Don't back down now. I woke with his words echoing in my mind, feeling oddly comforted. Whether a true visitation or just my subconscious processing, the dream had reinforced my resolve. Edward had prepared for this contingency. Now I needed to follow through on his foresight. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect early autumn day. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Tyler, choosing clothes that were stylish, but conservative, visual evidence of my competence and self-care. No one who saw me would imagine I needed supervision or protection. Ellie drove me to Crossroads Coffee, a charming independent cafe with exposed brick walls and mismatched vintage furniture. Tyler was already waiting, his lanky frame folded into a corner armchair, thumbs flying over his phone screen. He looked up as we approached, his face lighting with relief. Grandma! He enveloped me in a hug that nearly lifted me off my feet. Despite everything, I had to smile. Some things hadn't changed. You remember my friend Eleanor Morales? I said, gesturing to Ellie. Tyler nodded politely. Thanks for looking after my grandmother, ma'am. She's looking after herself just fine, Ellie replied with a pointed smile. I'm just providing the guest room. She glanced between us. I'll get us some coffee and give you two some privacy. Once she'd moved to the counter, Tyler leaned forward, his expression troubled. Grandma, what's really going on? Dad says you're having memory issues and making bad decisions, but you seem completely normal to me. I took a deep breath. Tyler, your father has been lying to you. I don't have any cognitive impairment. 3 separate specialists have confirmed that. Carefully, I explained what had happened, the unauthorized transfers from my accounts, the power of attorney obtained under false pretenses, the plan to force me into assisted living while liquidating my assets. Tyler's expression grew increasingly horrified. He said the power of attorney was just a precaution, he murmured, in case something happened to you. Something did happen, I said gently. Just not what he claimed. My only impairment was trusting my son too much. Tyler's jaw tightened, so like Edward's expression when he was angry. I knew something was off. Last week, Mom came home with a brand new Cartier watch. When I asked about it, she got all weird and defensive. Fresh wave of hurt washed over me. My daughter-in-law was wearing luxury items purchased with my stolen money. There's more, Tyler continued, his voice dropping. I overheard Dad talking to his partner Wesley. They're in serious financial trouble. Something about client accounts and the SEC investigating. Dad said, "Don't worry, I've secured an infusion of capital." That was the day after he had you sign those papers. Ellie returned with our coffees, setting them down carefully before taking the seat beside me. Tyler looked at her, then back at me. You're fighting this, right? Legally, I nodded. There's a court hearing on Tuesday. Your father's power of attorney has been temporarily suspended while they investigate. Tyler ran a hand through his hair, another gesture so like his grandfather's that it made my heart ache. I want to help. I can testify about what I've seen and heard. I reached for his hand. Tyler, that's a big step. It would mean publicly opposing your father. Are you sure you want to do that? His young face hardened with resolve. Grandma, what he's doing is wrong. You taught me to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. He squeezed my fingers, especially when it's hard. In that moment, looking at my grandson's determined expression, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and betrayal didn't disappear, but alongside them grew something else. A fierce pride in this young man who had absorbed the values I'd tried to instill, even when his own father had abandoned them. I have an appointment with Mr. Chen, your lawyer, this afternoon, Tyler continued. I already called his office. I'm going to tell him everything I know. I blinked back sudden tears. Your grandfather would be so proud of you. Tyler smiled, a flash of the little boy he'd been not so long ago. Gramps always said you were the strongest person he knew. Guess he was right. We talked for another hour, Tyler filling me in on what had been happening at home. Victoria was furious about the court intervention, threatening to contest it with her own high-priced attorneys. Daniel had been making frantic phone calls, his usual smooth demeanor cracking under pressure. The household staff, a housekeeper and gardener, who came weekly, had been dismissed to cut expenses. Dad keeps saying everything will calm down once you come to your senses, Tyler reported. But Mom's already measuring for new furniture in your house. She's calling it their retirement property. The casual entitlement was breathtaking. They hadn't just planned to control my assets. They'd intended to claim my home as their own, relegating me to an institutional setting while they enjoyed the fruits of Edward's and my lifetime of work. When it was time to leave, Tyler hugged me again. I'm staying on campus through all this, he assured me. Dad's too busy damage controlling to notice I'm not coming home. Be careful, I warned. Don't put yourself at risk. He straightened, suddenly looking older than his 19 years. I'm not the one who needs protection, Grandma. But don't worry, I've got backup too. As Ellie and I watched him stride away, she nudged my shoulder. That's one remarkable young man. You did something very right there. I didn't raise him, I reminded her. Daniel and Victoria did. Ellie snorted. Please, that boy spent every summer and school break at your house from the time he could walk. You and Edward were the constants in his life while his parents were chasing status and money. She gave me a knowing look. Tyler knows exactly who showed up for him, who taught him what matters, and it wasn't Daniel and Victoria. Back at the cottage, I called Raymond to update him on my conversation with Tyler. He was cautiously optimistic. Tyler's testimony could be very valuable, he noted. A family member contradicting Daniel's claims about your mental state adds another layer of credibility to our case. I'm worried about putting him in that position, I admitted, asking him to publicly oppose his father. From what you've told me, Margaret, Tyler made that choice himself. He has a strong moral compass, something he clearly learned from you and Edward. That evening, as Ellie and I prepared dinner together, slicing vegetables and setting the table with the easy rhythm of old friends, my phone rang. The screen showed a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Wilson, a woman's voice inquired when I answered. This is Judith Parker, Wesley Parker's wife. I nearly dropped the phone. Wesley was Daniel's business partner, the one reportedly facing SEC investigation. How did you get this number? I asked cautiously. From Tyler, she replied. He suggested I call you. There are things you should know about your son's business dealings, things that might help your case. Ellie watched with raised eyebrows as I put the call on speaker. Daniel and Wesley have been moving client funds around for at least 2 years, Judith explained, her voice tight with controlled anger, using them to cover personal expenses and losses from high-risk investments. They've created a shell game, taking from one account to cover shortfalls in another, hoping no one would notice. How do you know this? I asked. Because I found the documentation. Wesley got sloppy, left his laptop open with spreadsheets showing the transfers. When I confronted him, he admitted everything. Her voice hardened. Then he tried to convince me it was normal business practice. Temporary reallocations, he called it. That's theft, Ellie interjected. Exactly, Judith agreed. And it gets worse. When clients started asking questions, Daniel came up with a new source of capital. Your accounts, Mrs. Wilson. Wesley told me they saw it as a perfect solution, money they could access without oversight, since you'd never know. It was gone. A chill ran through me. They planned this months ago? At least 6 months. They've been laying the groundwork, creating a paper trail of supposed concerns about your mental capacity, consulting with a doctor who's known for being generous, with incompetency diagnoses for the right price. I thought of Dr. Watkins, the specialist Daniel had supposedly consulted. Do you have proof of any of this? I have copies of everything, Judith confirmed. Wesley doesn't know I've documented it all. I'm filing for divorce, but before I do, I wanted to make sure you had what you need to protect yourself. After arranging to meet Judith the following day at Raymond's office, I hung up and stared at Ellie in shock. This wasn't just opportunistic, I said slowly. It was premeditated. Daniel deliberately set out to take control of my assets months ago. Ellie squeezed my shoulder. But they didn't count on Edward's foresight, or your strength. That night, I wrote in the journal I'd kept since Edward's death. Usually I recorded memories, small daily joys, occasional worries. This entry was different, a clear-eyed accounting of what I'd learned and what I planned to do about it. I am not simply fighting for my finances, I wrote. I am fighting for my autonomy, my dignity, and my right to determine my own future. Daniel has betrayed not just my trust, but the values I thought I had instilled in him. That is a grief I will carry. But I will not allow that grief to weaken my resolve. In bed, listening to the gentle lapping of lake waves through the open window, I thought about resistance, how it takes different forms at different stages of life. In youth, we resist constraints, rules that seem arbitrary, futures others. Plan for us. In middle age, we resist compromising our values for security or acceptance. But in my 70s, I was engaged in perhaps the most important resistance of my life, against being diminished, dismissed, and disenfranchised by the very people who should have been my strongest advocates. It was a fight I had never anticipated, but one I now understood was essential, not just for me, but for every aging person facing similar attempts to usurp their autonomy. I thought of all the elders who might not have Edward's foresight, Raymond's loyalty, or Ellie's steadfast support, who might not have a Tyler willing to stand up for what's right, even against his own father. How many had been quietly stripped of their agency, their assets, their very personhood, all under the guise of protection? As sleep finally claimed me, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. This battle wasn't just about me. It was about drawing a line that desperately needed to be drawn. And I was exactly the right person to draw it. The morning of our meeting with Judith Parker dawned with a thunderstorm that matched my mood, dark, charged, and ready to break. Rain lashed against Ellie's cottage windows as we prepared to leave, the lake beyond a steel-gray blur. "Classics, dramatic weather," Ellie quipped, handing me an umbrella. "The universe has a flair for appropriate backdrops." Raymond's office was busier than usual when we arrived, his assistant ushering us straight into a conference room rather than his personal office. Judith Parker was already waiting, a sleek leather portfolio on the table before her. In person, she was a contrast to Victoria, understated elegance rather than flashy display, her only jewelry a simple wedding band and modest pearl earrings. "Mrs. Wilson," she greeted me, extending her hand. "I wish we were meeting under different circumstances." "Please call me Margaret," I replied, noting the faint tremor in her fingers as we shook hands. She was nervous, which was understandable. She was about to provide evidence against her husband and his business partner. Raymond joined us moments later, followed by a woman I didn't recognize, sharp-featured and professional in a tailored suit. "This is Marianne Lopez," Raymond introduced her. "She's a forensic accountant who specializes in financial fraud cases. Given what Mrs. Parker indicated on the phone, I thought her expertise would be valuable." Judith opened her portfolio and laid out a series of documents on the table: spreadsheets, email printouts, bank statements, and what appeared to be screenshots of text messages. "I've organized everything chronologically," she explained, her voice steady despite her obvious tension. "It starts about 8 months ago, when Wesley and Daniel first began discussing their liquidity problems." Marianne leaned forward, adjusting her glasses as she examined the documents. "These are internal records from their firm?" Judith nodded. "Wesley has always been careless with his passwords, and he has a habit of leaving work open on his laptop at home." A flash of something, hurt, anger, resignation, crossed her face. "When you've been married to someone for 20 years, you develop a sense for when they're hiding something." She walked us through the evidence methodically. It began with emails between Daniel and Wesley discussing alternative funding sources for their investment firm, which had suffered significant losses from high-risk ventures they had concealed from clients. Initial ideas included refinancing their properties or seeking outside investors. Then, about 6 months ago, the tone changed. An email from Daniel mentioned, "Considering options with my mother's estate," and significant untapped resources that could solve our immediate cash flow issues. "This is where it gets calculated," Judith said, pointing to a detailed spreadsheet. They actually created a cost-benefit analysis of different approaches to accessing Margaret's assets. Marianne studied the document, her expression hardening. They compared direct requests for loans against various methods of gaining control over her accounts without her knowledge. They even factored in the potential resistance cost, what they might need to spend on legal fees if she contested their actions. "They reduced me to a spreadsheet," I said quietly, a strange calm settling over me. "A problem to be solved." The evidence continued with a carefully documented timeline. Consultations with a Dr. Lawrence Watkins, who specialized in geriatric psychiatry, but had been reprimanded twice by the medical board for questionable competency evaluations. Meetings with an attorney specializing in guardianship cases. Research on assisted living facilities with different levels of monitoring and visitor restrictions. They were pricing out places where they could essentially sequester you, Raymond noted, his usual professional demeanor slipping to reveal genuine anger. The facilities with the most restrictive visitor policies were highlighted as preferred options. Most damning were the text messages between Daniel and Victoria discussing how to create a perception of my declining faculties. "We need to catch her making mistakes," Victoria had written. "Maybe move things around in her house so she can't find them?" Daniel's response: "Good idea. I've started telling everyone she's getting confused. Mentioned it to her doctor last time I took her. We need to build a record before we file the papers." I remembered those doctor visits, Daniel insisting on accompanying me for what should have been routine checkups, then having whispered conversations with Dr. Marshall afterward. At the time, I'd been touched by what I perceived as concern. Now I understood it as strategic manipulation. They never actually observed any cognitive decline, Judith confirmed. They were manufacturing evidence of it. Marianne tapped her pen against a bank statement. "These transfers, $4,000 here, $30,000 there, they line up perfectly with withdrawals from client accounts that were starting to ask questions. Your money was being used to cover their tracks, Mrs. Wilson." My stomach turned at the calculated nature of it all. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a desperate act in crisis. It was a meticulously planned campaign to strip me of my autonomy and resources. "What I don't understand," I said, "is why Daniel didn't just ask me for help. If his business was struggling, I would have considered a loan." Judith's expression softened with something like pity. "Based on what Wesley told me, they needed far more than a reasonable loan. They've mismanaged or misappropriated close to $1, $8 million in client funds. They needed access to all your assets, not just what you might willingly provide." The amount staggered me. My home and investments were valuable, but not enough to cover losses of that magnitude. Raymond must have read my expression. They weren't planning to repay the clients, Margaret. They were planning to use your assets to pacify the most vocal complainants while continuing the scheme. Once your resources were depleted, they'd likely have moved on to another target or simply declared bankruptcy and walked away. Leaving me penniless in assisted living, I finished quietly. Marianne gathered the papers, organizing them with practiced efficiency. "This is a textbook case of premeditated financial exploitation. The planning, the execution, the cover-up, it's all here. And it crosses well into criminal territory." "Criminal?" I echoed, the word hanging heavy in the air. "You mean charges could be filed?" Raymond and Marianne exchanged glances. "Yes," Raymond confirmed. "Securities fraud, wire fraud, elder financial abuse, possibly even conspiracy charges. The evidence Mrs. Parker has provided goes well beyond our civil case for voiding the power of attorney." I closed my eyes, trying to process the implications. Criminal charges would mean public exposure, court proceedings, perhaps even prison time for my son. The magnitude of it was almost unbearable. "I need to consider this carefully," I said, finally. "The power of attorney is one thing. Criminal charges are something else entirely." "Of course," Raymond assured me. "For now, our focus is Tuesday's hearing to permanently void the power of attorney and secure the return of your assets. These additional matters can be addressed separately when you're ready." As we were preparing to leave, Raymond pulled me aside. "Margaret, there's something else you should know. Daniel has filed an emergency motion to have you psychologically evaluated by a court-appointed expert, specifically Dr. Watkins." My blood ran cold. "The same doctor who's been mentioned in these documents? The one with the reprimands?" "The very same. His motion claims your erratic behavior and flight from home demonstrate deteriorating judgment. He's requesting the evaluation be conducted today or tomorrow before Tuesday's hearing. That's absurd, Ellie interjected, having overheard. It's a transparent attempt to create evidence in his favor. Raymond nodded grimly. Exactly. I've filed an objection based on Dr. Watkins's history of questionable evaluations, as well as the fact that Margaret has already been assessed by 3 independent specialists. We have a phone conference with Judge Wilkins in an hour to address it. The rain had stopped by the time we left Raymond's office, though dark clouds still hung low over the city. Ellie suggested lunch at a small cafe nearby, while we waited for news about the emergency motion. I keep thinking about something, I said as we settled at a corner table, warm soup steaming before us. All those documents showed Daniel and Victoria planning to control my assets, but they never once mentioned what would happen to me afterward. Ellie reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Because you weren't a person to them in this scenario, Peggy. You were an obstacle to resources they wanted. The realization cut deeper than any financial betrayal. My son, the baby I had cradled, the child I had nurtured, the young man I had celebrated, had reduced me to a problem, to be managed, not even worth considering as a human being with needs and dignity. I'm not sure I can ever forgive that, I admitted, my voice barely audible. You don't have to, Ellie said firmly. Some things shouldn't be forgiven. They should be recognized for what they are and met with appropriate boundaries. My phone rang. Raymond calling with news from the judge. Motion denied, he announced, satisfaction evident in his voice. Judge Wilkins was not impressed with Daniel's tactics. She specifically noted that attempting to force an evaluation by a doctor with a history of ethical complaints smacked of forum shopping for a favorable diagnosis rather than genuine concern. Relief flooded through me. One potential ambush avoided. There's more, Raymond continued. Based on the evidence we've presented, the judge has expanded Tuesday's hearing. She's requesting financial records from Daniel's firm going back 3 years, and she's added Victoria to the proceedings as a potential co-conspirator. When the call ended, I felt lightheaded, partly from relief, partly from the escalating stakes. What had begun as a simple petition to void a power of attorney was expanding into something far more consequential. What are you thinking? Ellie asked, studying my face. I'm thinking that Edward was right all along, I said slowly. He saw something in Daniel that I refused to see. A fundamental lack of character that no amount of parenting could fix. The revelation was painful but clarifying. For decades, I had made excuses for Daniel's self-centeredness, attributing it to ambition or the high-pressure world of finance. I had overlooked his casual disregard for others' needs, his tendency to manipulate situations to his advantage, his growing obsession with status and appearances. Edward had been more clear-eyed. He'd loved Daniel, but he'd never trusted him implicitly the way I had. That's why he'd created the backup plan with Raymond, not just to protect our assets, but to protect me from the son whose character he'd accurately assessed. The sadness of that realization was profound. My husband had known our child better than I had seen the potential for betrayal that I'd been blind to, and rather than shatter my illusions, he'd quietly put safeguards in place for when, not if, they were needed. Back at Ellie's cottage, I retreated to the deck overlooking the lake. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a freshly washed world, colors more vivid against the retreating dark clouds. I wrapped myself in a soft blanket and watched a pair of loons diving for fish, their haunting calls echoing across the water. Tyler texted to report that he'd given his statement to Raymond, and that the atmosphere at his parents' house was growing increasingly tense. Daniel had been on the phone until midnight, his voice rising in what sounded like panic. Victoria had retreated to her sister's house, taking several suitcases and her most valuable jewelry. They're fighting about money, Tyler wrote. Dad keeps saying he can fix everything if Mom will just be patient. She keeps saying she didn't sign up for this. I wasn't surprised. Victoria had always been attracted to the trappings of success, not the struggle to achieve it. If Daniel's carefully constructed facade of prosperity was crumbling, her commitment would likely crumble with it. That evening, Howard Jenkins called with an update from my neighborhood. "Thought you should know," he said, his judicial voice matter of fact. "There's been activity at your house. A moving truck came this afternoon. 2 men loaded several large items, furniture mostly. Daniel supervised but left before they finished. My grip tightened on the phone. He's taking my furniture now, without any legal right? It appears so. I documented everything from my front window. License plates, timestamps, specific items. I've already emailed the information to Raymond." I thanked him for his vigilance, fighting a fresh wave of outrage. The audacity was breathtaking, to continue pillaging my home even after the power of attorney had been suspended, even knowing a court hearing was imminent. Before I could dwell on it further, my phone rang again. An unfamiliar number, but with our local area code. I answered cautiously. "Mrs. Wilson, this is Cynthia from Oak Ridge Bank." The voice was professional, but with an undercurrent of concern. "I'm calling about some unusual activity on your accounts." My heart rate accelerated. "What kind of activity?" "There have been multiple attempts to access your accounts today using your online banking credentials. Policy prevents me from sharing specifics over the phone, but given the recent fraud alert placed on your accounts, I wanted to verify if these attempts were coming from you." "They absolutely were not," I confirmed. "My banking access was part me of what was improperly taken through a now-suspended power of attorney." "That's what our records indicated." Cynthia's voice grew more confidential. "Mrs. Wilson, I should tell you that these attempts originated from an IP address associated with Wilson Financial Advisors. We've temporarily locked all your accounts for security purposes and flagged this for our fraud department." After thanking her for the alert, I immediately called Raymond to report this latest development. "He's getting desperate," Raymond observed grimly. "Trying to extract whatever he can before Tuesday's hearing cuts off his access permanently." "Can he actually access anything? I thought the accounts were frozen." "The transfers you've identified are frozen, but determined parties can sometimes find workarounds. Accounts you might have forgotten, lines of credit in your name, even attempting to take out loans using your home as collateral." A chill ran through me. "He wouldn't—" At this point, Margaret, I think we have to assume he would try anything. The good news is, banks are on high alert for exactly this type of activity. That's why Cynthia called you directly. That night, sleep eluded me. I paced Ellie's guest room, watching moonlight play across the lake's rippled surface. The magnitude of Daniel's betrayal seemed to expand with each new revelation. Not content with stealing my savings and planning to sell my home, he was now apparently scrambling to extract whatever remaining value he could from my name and credit. What had happened to the boy who had once made me Mother's Day cards with earnestly misspelled declarations of love? Who had cried in my arms when he wasn't chosen for the baseball team? Who had beamed with pride when Edward taught him to change the oil in our old Buick? Had that child been an illusion? Or had something fundamental changed, some slow corruption of character that I'd been too close to see clearly? Around 3 a.m., restless and seeking distraction, I opened the small wooden box of keepsakes I'd rescued from my house. Among Edward's watch and our wedding photos was a small leather journal I'd forgotten about, Edward's private notes that I'd found after his death. I had read parts of it years ago, but set it aside when the fresh grief made his written voice too painful to bear. Now, by the soft light of a bedside lamp, I opened it again, fingers tracing his familiar handwriting. The journal wasn't chronological, but thematic, with sections devoted to different aspects of our life together. I turned to the section labeled Daniel, my heart constricting at what I might find. Edward's observations were loving but clear-eyed, starting from Daniel's childhood and continuing until just months before Edward's death. Early entries noted Daniel's intelligence, his charm, his ability to talk his way into or out of nearly any situation. But as the years progressed, Edward's concerns emerged with increasing clarity. April 1989. Daniel lied about the broken window, blamed the Johnson boy. When I found out the truth and confronted him, he showed no remorse, only anger at being caught. Maggie thinks he'll outgrow this. I'm not so sure. March 1997. Another call from school. D charmed his way out of plagiarism consequences. Teacher actually apologized to him for the misunderstanding. His manipulation skills are concerning. Talk to Maggie about counseling. She thinks I'm overreacting. September 2006. D's investment scheme collapsed. He came asking for money. Not a loan, just cash. When I refused, offering to help him find legitimate work instead, he turned cold. Called me controlling, ungenerous. Later told Maggie I'd insulted him. Classic triangulation. She believes him, of course. The pattern continued. Incidents of dishonesty, manipulation, entitlement, all observed with Edward's characteristic precision. The final entry in the section was dated just 3 months before his death. January 2010. Meeting with Raymond tomorrow. Need to protect Maggie after I'm gone. D has been asking too many questions about our finances lately. Something predatory in his interest. V encourages his worst instincts. Maggie deserves better than to have her life's work stripped away by her own son. She won't see the threat until it's too late. I need to create safeguards she can activate when needed. Tears blurred my vision as I closed the journal. Edward had seen it all, had tried to warn me in his gentle way, and I, blinded by maternal love, had dismissed his concerns. Now, a decade after his death, his foresight was the only thing standing between me and financial ruin. The revelation was bittersweet. Painful in its confirmation of my son's true nature, but comforting in the evidence of Edward's enduring protection. Even knowing I wouldn't listen, he had found a way to ensure I would be safe when the crisis inevitably came. As dawn broke over the lake, I made a decision. This wasn't just about recovering my assets anymore. It was about honoring Edward's protective instincts and finally acknowledging the truth he had tried to show me. Daniel hadn't suddenly changed. He had finally revealed who he had always been. When Ellie emerged from her room, she found me at the kitchen table, Edward's journal open beside a notepad filled with my handwritten notes. "You look like you've been up all night," she observed, heading for the coffee maker. "I have been. Reading Edward's journal." I pushed it toward her. "He saw all of this coming, Ellie. Years ago." She skimmed a few pages, her expression softening. "Oh, Peggy, he was trying to protect you. Not just protect me. Prepare me." I tapped my notepad. "I've been making a list of every incident I can remember that fits the pattern Edward identified. Times when Daniel manipulated situations, lied without remorse, used people instrumentally. There are so many that I simply excused or rationalized away." Ellie sat beside me, coffee forgotten. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time to stop protecting Daniel from the consequences of his actions." My voice was steady, resolved. "Not just for my sake, but for all the clients he's defrauded, all the people he's manipulated and used. This pattern won't stop with me. It's who he is." "You're considering the criminal charges," Ellie surmised. I nodded. "I need to talk to Raymond about what that would mean. I don't want vengeance, but I do want accountability." After breakfast, I called Raymond to request a meeting that afternoon. He agreed immediately, sensing the shift in my resolve. "I'll have the relevant information prepared," he assured me. "If you're considering pressing charges, there are several approaches we could take, ranging from formal complaints to regulatory agencies to direct coordination with the district attorney's office." The morning passed in quiet preparation. I continued my list, each entry strengthening my conviction. Memory after memory surfaced. Daniel convincing an elderly neighbor to invest in a guaranteed return scheme that somehow dissolved without returns. Daniel using his position as treasurer of Tyler's school fundraising committee to temporarily reallocate funds that were never fully replaced. Daniel persuading a recent widower from our church to sign over management of his late wife's life insurance payout, then delivering suspiciously minimal returns. Each incident alone could be explained away. Together, they formed an unmistakable pattern of exploitation and financial predation. And I had enabled it through my silence, my excuses, my unwillingness to see what Edward had seen so clearly. Around noon, Ellie's doorbell rang, an unusual occurrence at her secluded cottage. Through the front window, I glimpsed a sleek silver Mercedes in the driveway, Victoria's car. Ellie looked at me questioningly. I nodded, bracing myself. Victoria burst in the moment Ellie opened the door, not bothering with greetings or pretense. Always slim, she looked almost gaunt now, her designer outfit hanging loosely on her frame, her carefully maintained appearance showing signs of strain. The courthouse stood like a sentinel in the morning light, its limestone facade gleaming against the clear blue sky. I paused at the bottom of the wide steps, taking a moment to steady myself. The weight of what awaited inside pressed against my chest, not just a legal proceeding, but a public reckoning with my son's betrayal. "Ready?" Ellie asked softly beside me. I nodded, straightening my shoulders. I had chosen my outfit carefully that morning. A tailored navy dress that Edward had always admired, pearl earrings he had given me on our 30th anniversary, sensible but elegant shoes. No trace of the confused, declining woman Daniel had tried to portray. Raymond met us in the lobby, his usual calm demeanor firmly in place despite the gravity of the occasion. "Judge Wilkins is known for running a tight courtroom," he advised as we walked toward the assigned chamber. "She doesn't tolerate grandstanding or emotional manipulation. Stick to the facts, even if Daniel or his attorney tries to provoke an emotional response." We turned a corner and nearly collided with Daniel and Victoria standing with a man I didn't recognize, presumably their attorney. Daniel was immaculately dressed as always, but stress had left its mark in the tight lines around his mouth, the slight disarray of his usually perfect hair. Victoria stood slightly apart from him, her body language suggesting discord. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel stepped forward, his expression a practiced mix of concern and authority. "Mom," he began, his voice low and controlled. "It's not too late to stop this. We can still work things out privately, as a family." Before I could respond, Victoria cut in, her tone sharp. "Daniel, don't bother. She's made her choice." She fixed me with a cold stare. She'd rather destroy her family than admit she needs help. The unknown man placed a restraining hand on Victoria's arm. "Mrs. Wilson, Mr. Wilson, I strongly advise against any further conversation with the petitioner before the hearing." He nodded stiffly in my direction. "Mrs. Wilson." Raymond guided me past them, his hand firm at my elbow. "Remember what we discussed," he murmured. "Facts, not emotions." The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, with warm wood paneling and the state seal prominently displayed behind the judge's bench. Several people were already seated: Judith Parker with a man I assumed was her attorney, Howard Jenkins in a crisp suit, and to my surprise, Tyler in the back row. When he saw me, Tyler hurried over, embracing me quickly before Judge Wilkins entered. "I'm here for you, Grandma," he whispered, "no matter what happens." Judge Frances Wilkins was a striking woman in her early 60s, with silver-streaked dark hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they landed on. She moved with brisk efficiency, settling at the bench and surveying the courtroom with practiced assessment. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and authoritative. We're here in the matter of Wilson versus Wilson, petition to void power of attorney on grounds of fraud and financial exploitation, with additional motions regarding financial recovery and protective orders. She looked directly at me. Before we begin, I want to state for the record that I have reviewed all submitted materials thoroughly, including medical evaluations, financial records, and the substantial documentary evidence provided by both parties. The hearing began with Raymond presenting our case, methodically outlining how Daniel had obtained power of attorney under false pretenses, misrepresented my mental capacity, and systematically transferred funds from my accounts. He introduced the independent medical evaluations confirming my competence and submitted Edward's springing trust documentation that provided the legal foundation for our challenge. Throughout Raymond's presentation, I kept my expression composed, my gaze steady. Occasionally, I glanced at Daniel, searching for some flicker of shame or remorse, but his face remained an impassive mask. When Raymond finished, Judge Wilkins turned to Daniel's attorney, a sharp-featured man named Gregory Palmer. "Counsel, your response?" Palmer rose smoothly. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge certain procedural irregularities in how Mr. Wilson handled his mother's finances, we maintain that his actions were ultimately protective in nature. Mrs. Wilson has demonstrated increasingly concerning judgment, particularly regarding financial matters. Her current behavior, fleeing her home, refusing contact with family, aligning herself with individuals who have historical animosity toward her son, only confirms the concerns that prompted Mr. Wilson's intervention." My hands clenched in my lap as Palmer spun a narrative that twisted every fact into its opposite, portraying my self-protection as evidence of instability, my resistance to exploitation as proof I needed management. It was gaslighting elevated to legal strategy. Furthermore, Palmer continued, Mrs. Wilson's claims are heavily influenced by Raymond Chen, who has maintained an unusual interest in the Wilson family finances since Edward Wilson's death. Mr. Chen was disappointed when Edward Wilson expressed his wish for his son to eventually manage family assets, and this petition appears to be his attempt to wrest control from the rightful family manager. Judge Wilkins raised a hand, interrupting Palmer's flow. "Counsel, I'm not interested in unsubstantiated attacks on Mr. Chen's professional integrity. Do you have evidence to refute the medical evaluations confirming Mrs. Wilson's competence, or documentation contradicting the financial records showing unauthorized transfers?" Palmer hesitated. "Your Honor, we have statements from family members attesting to concerning behaviors." "Family members being Mr. Wilson and his wife?" Judge Wilkins asked dryly. "And others who have observed Mrs. Wilson's decline," Palmer asserted. "Additionally, we have documentation of the legitimate financial planning reasons behind the transfers in question." Judge Wilkins leaned forward. "I'd be very interested in seeing that documentation, counsel, given that the bank records clearly show the funds being used for purchases at luxury retailers and deposits into Mr. Wilson's business accounts." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Palmer's face. Judge Wilkins turned toward me. "Mrs. Wilson, would you approach the bench, please?" Raymond accompanied me as I walked forward on legs that felt surprisingly steady. "Up close, Judge." Wilkins's gaze was even more penetrating but not unkind. "Mrs. Wilson, I have some direct questions for you." She consulted a notepad. "When did you first become aware that your son had obtained power of attorney over your affairs?" 3 months after the fact, Your Honor," I replied clearly. "When I discovered unauthorized transfers from my bank accounts, and at any point prior to signing the power of attorney documents, did your son explain that he would have complete control over your finances and living arrangements?" "No, Your Honor. He presented it as routine paperwork updating my insurance and medical directives. He specifically said it was just a precaution and would only activate if I became incapacitated." Judge Wilkins nodded, making a note. "Were you experiencing any cognitive difficulties or memory issues at the time you signed these documents?" "None whatsoever, Your Honor. I've undergone thorough evaluations by 3 independent specialists, all of whom found no cognitive impairment. Of any kind. Yes, I've reviewed those evaluations. She tapped her pen thoughtfully. Mrs. Wilson, what prompted you to leave your home and stay with Ms. Morales? I discovered that my son had emptied my primary savings account, frozen my access to my own funds, and was preparing to force me into an assisted living facility against my will. When I objected, he informed me that under the power of attorney, my preferences were irrelevant. I left because I feared for my financial security and personal autonomy. The judge's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened. And you have reason to believe that Mr. Wilson might take more drastic measures if you remained at home? I hesitated, aware of Daniel's gaze boring into me from across the courtroom. Yes, Your Honor. Daniel made it clear that he intended to relocate, me regardless of my wishes. He had already made deposits at Willow Creek Estates and begun packing up my personal belongings. I later discovered that he and Victoria had placed a lockbox on my home and were showing it to real estate agents while telling neighbors I was mentally unfit to live independently. Just as the judge was about to respond, the courtroom doors opened and a uniformed officer entered, approaching the bench with a document. Judge Wilkins reviewed it quickly, her expression growing more severe. Counsel, she addressed both attorneys. I've just received information that requires immediate attention. Mr. Wilson's business partner, Wesley Parker, has surrendered himself to authorities this morning and provided a detailed statement regarding the misappropriation of client funds and Mrs. Wilson's assets. She looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Wilson, in light of this development, do you wish to modify your position regarding this petition? The courtroom fell silent. I watched as my son, the boy I had raised, the man I had trusted, visibly calculated his options, weighing self-preservation against truth. Even now, facing exposure and potential criminal charges, his instinct was not contrition, but calculation. Your Honor, Palmer interjected, rising from his seat. We request a brief recess to confer with our client in light of this new information. Judge. Wilkins nodded. 20 minutes. But I advise Mr. Wilson to consider his position very carefully. Perjury would significantly compound his legal difficulties. During the recess, I sat quietly, watching Daniel and Palmer engaged in intense, whispered conversation across the room. Victoria had moved to sit separately, her body language radiating anger and distress. Tyler approached quietly, slipping into the seat beside me. You okay, Grandma? He asked, his young face creased with concern. I clasped his hand, drawing strength from his presence. I'm fine, sweetheart. This is difficult, but necessary. Tyler nodded, his expression sober beyond his years. Dad always taught me that actions have consequences. I guess he's learning that lesson himself now. When court resumed, the shift in Daniel's demeanor was immediately apparent. The confident facade had cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. Palmer addressed the court with markedly less certainty than before. Your Honor, in light of recent developments, my client wishes to withdraw his opposition to the petition to void the power of attorney. He acknowledges that certain financial transactions were improper and is prepared to facilitate the immediate return of all funds removed from Mrs. Wilson's accounts. Judge Wilkins regarded Daniel coolly. Mr. Wilson, do you understand that withdrawing your opposition to this petition does not shield you from potential civil or criminal liability for actions taken under the fraudulently obtained power of attorney? Daniel swallowed visibly. I understand, Your Honor. Very well. Based on the evidence presented and the respondent's withdrawal of opposition, I am issuing an immediate order voiding the power of attorney granted to Daniel Wilson by Margaret Wilson on grounds of fraud and financial exploitation. She continued with a series of additional orders, freezing any remaining transferred assets pending full accounting, prohibiting Daniel from entering my property or contacting me directly, requiring the return of all personal items removed from my home, and referring the matter to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges. As the hearing concluded, I felt no triumph, only a profound sadness tinged with relief. The legal victory was necessary but hollow, a formal acknowledgement of a family irreparably fractured. Outside the courtroom, Daniel approached me as Raymond and Ellie were discussing next steps. His composure had completely dissolved, revealing a desperate vulnerability I hadn't seen since he was a child. "Mom," he whispered urgently, "can we talk? Just for a minute, please." Raymond started to intervene, but I raised a hand to stop him. "It's all right," I said quietly. "Just a moment." We stepped a few paces away, still within sight of my protectors, but with a semblance of privacy. "Mom, you have to help me," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "They're talking about criminal charges, prison. I could lose everything." I studied my son's face, the face I had once known better than my own. "What exactly are you asking me to do, Daniel?" "Tell them you don't want to press charges, that it was a misunderstanding, a family matter that's been resolved." His eyes pleaded with mine. "I'm your son, Mom, your only child." The weight of those words hung between us. For a moment, I felt the familiar pull of maternal protection, the instinct to shield my child from harm, regardless of the cause. But beneath that instinct lay a deeper truth. Real love didn't enable destructive behavior. It held accountable. "Daniel," I said gently, "I will always love the child you were, but I cannot protect you from the consequences of your actions." His face hardened in an instant, the vulnerability replaced by cold anger. "After everything I've done for you, after all these years," he shook his head in disgust. "You're choosing strangers over your own family." "No, Daniel, I'm choosing truth over deception, justice over exploitation." I met his gaze steadily. "Those aren't abstract principles. They're the foundation of real love. Something I failed to teach you, apparently." Before he could respond, Victoria appeared at his side, tugging his arm urgently. "Daniel, we need to leave. The reporters are outside." She glanced at me with undisguised hostility before pulling him away. As I watched them go, Tyler stepped up beside me. "Are you okay, Grandma?" I put my arm around his shoulders, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "I am, sweetheart. It's painful, but necessary." "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," I replied, "we rebuild." The following weeks unfolded in a whirlwind of practical and emotional adjustments. With Raymond's help, I recovered most of the funds Daniel had taken, though some had been irretrievably spent on luxuries for Victoria and investments in Daniel's failing firm. Howard Jenkins organized a community effort to help me reclaim my home, which had been partially emptied during my absence. The legal consequences for Daniel escalated quickly. The SEC investigation into Wilson Financial Advisors revealed a pattern of exploitation targeting elderly clients spanning nearly 3 years. Criminal charges were filed not just for my case, but for multiple counts of securities fraud and financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. Wesley Parker's cooperation with authorities secured him a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony against Daniel. Throughout this process, I maintained my resolve not to intervene on Daniel's behalf, despite increasingly desperate pleas from both him and Victoria. It wasn't vengeful justice I sought, but appropriate accountability, not just for myself, but for all those who had been harmed by his actions. 6 weeks after the hearing, I officially moved back into my home. The house felt different now, not just because some beloved items were still missing, but because I had changed. The experience had stripped away illusions I had harbored for decades, forcing me to see clearly not only who Daniel truly was, but who I was as well. I was not merely a widow, a mother, a grandmother, roles defined by my relationship to others. I was Margaret Wilson, a woman of strength and resilience, capable of standing firm in difficult truths and rebuilding from betrayal. On a crisp autumn morning, 2 months after the court hearing, I sat in my garden room surrounded by the houseplants that had somehow survived my absence. Shafts of sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The doorbell rang, an unexpected sound in my newly quiet life. I opened the door to find Tyler standing on the porch, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "Grandma," he said, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "I was wondering if I could stay here for a while, just until the end of the semester. The dorms are... It's hard to focus with everything going on." I understood the unspoken truth. With Daniel facing trial and Victoria having filed for divorce, Tyler's family home had become an emotional battleground he needed to escape. "Your room is always ready," I told him, opening the door wider. "Stay as long as you need." That evening, as we shared a simple dinner at my kitchen table, Tyler looked up from his plate with an expression of cautious hope. "Grandma, I've been thinking about something, about the future." He hesitated, then continued. "Dad always wanted me to go into finance to eventually take over the firm. But I've been talking to Professor Jenkins in the environmental science department. And there's this internship next summer with a conservation group in Michigan." His voice trailed off, uncertainty clouding his features. I recognized the look, the same one I had seen in the mirror for years whenever I considered stepping outside the narrow role others had defined for me. "Tyler," I said firmly, "your life is yours to shape, not anyone else's, not your father's, not Victoria's, not even mine. The only person who has to live with your choices is you." Relief washed over his face. "That's what I thought you'd say." Dad always made it seem like there was only one right path, but that never felt true to me. It wasn't true for him either, I said softly. He just didn't have the courage to forge his own path. As the weeks passed, Tyler's presence brought unexpected joy to my reconstructed life. We established new routines, morning coffee on the IZ deck, evening walks through the neighborhood, weekend trips to the farmer's market. He helped me create a small home office where I began volunteering as a financial literacy coach for seniors through a program Raymond had connected me with. 3 months after the hearing, Daniel accepted a plea deal that included restitution to victims, substantial fines, and a 5-year prison sentence. The news brought no satisfaction, only a quiet acknowledgement that justice, however painful, was necessary. On the anniversary of Edward's death, Tyler accompanied me to the cemetery. As we stood before the simple headstone, I felt Edward's presence more strongly than I had in years. "I finally saw what you saw," I whispered. "I finally acted on it. Thank you for giving me the tools to protect myself when I was ready." Tyler placed a hand on my shoulder. "Gramps always said you were the strongest person he knew. Now I understand what he meant." That evening, Ellie and Howard joined us for dinner. As we gathered around my dining table, the original one I had recovered from a consignment shop where Victoria had sold it, I looked at the faces of these people who had stood by me through the darkest chapter of my life. "I want to propose a toast," I said, raising my glass. "Not to endings or beginnings, but to truth. To seeing clearly, even when it hurts. To standing firm, even when it's difficult. And to rebuilding, even when it seems impossible." As our glasses clinked, I felt something I hadn't expected to find again after such betrayal. Peace. Not the fragile piece of illusion, but the sturdy piece of authenticity. The power of attorney that Daniel had taken for my protection had been intended to diminish me, to render me powerless and dependent. Instead, it had become the catalyst for discovering just how strong I truly was. Edward's backup plan had protected more than my assets. It had preserved my opportunity to reclaim my power, my dignity, and ultimately, my true self. In the garden, room where this journey had begun, I now sat most mornings, watching the sunrise paint my reclaimed world in shades of possibility. The plants that had survived my absence now thrived, putting forth new growth. Like them, I had endured a dark season only to emerge stronger, reaching toward the light with renewed purpose. My son had taken power of attorney for my protection, but my lawyer's secret backup plan had given me something far more valuable: the chance to protect myself, not just financially, but spiritually and emotionally as well. In doing so, I had discovered that the most powerful legal document wasn't a power of attorney at all. It was the unwritten covenant we make with ourselves to honor truth, embrace strength, and insist on dignity, no matter what challenges we face. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.